In 1970, George C. Scott starred in one of his most famous roles, and that was of U.S. General George S. Patton for the movie Patton. The film was directed by Franklin Schaffner from a script by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund North. It's often said that the very act of putting a story on film, however true the source material may be, immediately turns it into a myth. But what happens when the figure that represents the movie is already a myth to start with? That's basically part of the intrigue surrounding the movie Patton and its 1970 story about General George S. Patton, the heavily decorated commander that became such an important figure in the Second World War. The movie actually begins without showing the 20th Century Fox logo or any other indication that the film is starting. At military bases across the U.S., theater owners reported that soldiers in the audience would often stand up and snap to attention when they heard the movie's opening line, "Tin Hut," assuming it to be a real call to attention. Now, initially, George C. Scott refused to film the famous speech in front of the American flag when he had learned that the speech was going to come at the opening of the film. He felt if they put that scene at the beginning, then the rest of his performance would not live up to that scene. So the director actually lied a little bit to Scott, and he told him that that scene would end up at the end of the film. George C. Scott won the Academy Award for Best Actor in this movie and famously refused to accept it, claiming that he just didn't like competition between actors. He felt it was unfair, and he also disliked the Academy's voting process. He just basically called the Academy Awards a big meat parade, which I don't think he's too far off on that deal. Now, soldiers that actually served under the real George S. Patton said that the general's voice was surprisingly high-pitched and seemed somewhat out of character for him. And this can actually be heard on some vintage films and recordings of him. Patton himself actually said that he used profanity so liberally in order to compensate for this flaw in his voice. Now, according to co-star Carl Malden, George C. Scott had an affinity for playing ping pong, and he caused an extreme shooting delay by getting totally immersed in a ping pong tournament against a world champion table tennis player. Now, Scott was in full costume and makeup, and he kept losing to the champ. But he was bound and determined to win at least one set, even if he had to stand there all night and keep playing the entire night. This held up production for quite a while. Now, George C. Scott just didn't feel like he did this character justice. He didn't feel like he captured the full character of the man, George S. Patton. And he would actually directly apologize to Franklin J. Schaffner on the set for not realizing the complexity of the man and the poor job that he felt like he was doing. I think he was totally wrong on his interpretation of this, because this is one of the most explosive portrayals in a movie that you will see. Now, many of the quotes from the opening speech are actually real quotes that George S. Patton said. However, not all of them were said at one time. Rather, the speech is kind of a assemblage of different Patton moments throughout his career. Now, in reality, George S. Patton slapped and berated two soldiers in Sicily. One of them was Private Charles Cole, and this happened on August 3rd, 1943, and the other was Private Paul Bennett on August 10th. Now, they tried to cover this up somewhat by suggesting that Patton was sleep deprived, but he wrote in an entry in his diary after the slapping event that he was unrepentant for his actions. In his opinion, was that Cole was actually a coward. Patton was ordered by Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower to apologize privately to the soldiers and the hospital staff that was present. Also, the slapping incidents were kept secret from the public for months before the story was actually broken by the reporter Drew Pearson. And this caused this scandal to pop out for Patton's conduct and also the accusations of a cover-up on the Army's part. Now, this movie is one of President Richard Nixon's favorite films. He had his own print, and he would often watch it in the White House. And he did this particularly before having to make an important military decision, be it in Vietnam or Cambodia. Now, John Wayne got turned down for this role. He eagerly sought the role of George S. Patton. Now, it's hard to believe that John Wayne got turned down for anything, but he did. The producer, Frank McCarthy, thought that George C. Scott was a better match. Now, all of the medals and decorations shown on Patton's uniform in the opening monologue are replicas of those actually awarded to Patton. However, the general never wore all of them in public. He wore all of them only on one occasion in his backyard in Virginia at the request of his wife, who wanted a picture of him with all his medals. The producers actually used a copy of that photo to help recreate the look for the opening scene. Now, those statements in those opening scenes, even though they are quotes from things that he said, they have still been sanitized because they were riddled with profane language. The censors cut them out because they didn't think it would be appropriate for this type of film. But in real life, he was full of bad words. Late in the movie, Patton makes the statement that fixed fortifications are monuments to the stupidity of man. If mountain ranges and oceans can be overcome, then anything built by man can be overcome. And he is referring to the Siegfried Line, which he is about to smash through on his way into Germany. George C. Scott's drinking and behavior was pretty much out of control during the filming of this movie. His on-set behavior had become almost bizarre. People said he was acting insane personally. Everybody loved his acting. The man was a super skilled guy, but he was losing it mentally. And I think a big portion of this was to the old demon rum. At one point, after the film was done, his drinking became so robust and so intense that he was pretty much isolated. That's all he wanted to do. Eventually, doctors convinced him to sober up, and he did stay sober for a while. Eventually, I think he returned to the same demons that had haunted him before. You see this so often with these actors in Hollywood that reach these pinnacles that they strive to reach, and then they succumb to these substances that just take over their life. I find it really sad and somewhat bewildering. Carl Malden even states that it caused him to quit drinking just to see the results that were happening to George C. Scott. That influenced him so greatly that he turned into a teetotaler. Now, one of the film's premieres was held at West Point, and that was George S. Patton's alma mater. George C. Scott and Carl Malden were among the people that were in attendance. They had a dinner at the cadet mess hall with the Corps of Cadets prior to the premiere. At the end of the film, the monologue Patton gives about the ancient Roman triumph was actually lifted from a 1962 book by Robert Payne called The Roman Triumph, and this is from that first paragraph. For over 1,000 years, Roman conquerors returning from the wars enjoyed the honor of triumph. In the procession came trumpeters and musicians and strange animals from the conquered territories, together with carts laden with treasure and captured armaments. The conqueror rode in a triumphal chariot, and the day's prisoners walked in front of him. Sometimes his children, robed in white, stood with him in the chariot, or rode the trace horses. A slave stood behind the conqueror, holding a golden crown over his head, and whispering in his ear a warning that all glory is fleeting. What an excellent movie this is. Take a look back at it. You'll be impressed with some excellent acting on George C. Scott's part. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.